Rick Sanchez versus the Doctor is an interesting death battle for me to talk about because I'm approaching it as an outsider to both of these characters. Rick and Morty never seemed like it would be up my alley, and Doctor Who's massive history makes it a little too intimidating for me to just jump into it on a whim. So while I was excited to learn about both Rick and the Doctor by watching this episode, I also expected to miss most of the references and perhaps even find the episode less appealing as a result. Now, thankfully the episode turned out pretty great despite that personal disconnect, so you won't be hearing too much about that here. But if you would like to hear from people who know the first thing about Rick and the Doctor, you should definitely give Biff's review of this one a watch. He and our friend Ollie, aka Ribbit Theater, are much more familiar with the series in question, and I don't doubt that they're going to be able to identify all the smaller details much better than I ever could. That doesn't mean I won't try to, though, so I hope you'll stick with me as I get into this high-tech battle of geniuses, detailing what I think it gets right and what I thought could have been improved. Rick's analysis is pretty good. It's a fun romp through his origin and adventures with writing that mimics his source material, chock full of sci-fi goodness with a healthy splash of morbid absurdism. It covers enough of his inventions and feats to get across how insanely capable Rick is without feeling drawn out, even throwing in some deeper cuts like the true level stuff. I appreciate it when death battles can work in stuff like this. It's not relevant to a versus debate, but it does a lot to flesh out the limits of what a character can do. The humor in this rundown feels very fitting as well. It doesn't overuse the obvious stuff like Pickle Rick or Wubba-Lubba-Dub-Dub, instead letting Ben and Chad's line deliveries and some visual gags carry the jokes. The cutaway gag is a great example of this, with Wiz and Boomstick's exchange after Dummy gets yoinked by portal tentacles getting a solid laugh out of me. Also, Wiz petting Dummy like this is just adorable.
That's the cutest fucking thing I've ever seen in my entire life.
I find myself struggling to say much more about this rundown, but that's no fault of the episode. It's well paced, the coverage of Rick's feats and tech was fun, the music choices were fitting, so on and so forth. I'm just not left with much to say about it as someone who's not very interested in Rick and Morty. There are some more structural things I liked about how the rundown was written, but I think that's best saved for after we tackle the Doctor's analysis. So let's do that next. The Doctor's rundown feels just as well paced as Rick's does, which is frankly a miracle of its production. This is just about the longest analysis of Season 10, clocking in at just under 8 minutes in length. That's a runtime only rivaled by Obito, Martian Manhunter, and Silver Surfer. And speaking for myself, I only really notice that length when I'm actively reminding myself of it, because it isn't felt at all when watching normally. That's a testament to how compelling their coverage of the Doctor is, fitting over 60 years of content into an analysis that manages to not feel bloated. It's kinda funny how two such characters were back-to-back in the episode lineup, huh? Anyway, yeah, the Doctor's analysis being my preferred one to come out of this episode is a pretty easy call to make. The main reason I've not looked deeper into Doctor Who, like I said before, is its daunting size, so this serves as a helpful and engrossing introduction to the Doctor, his world, and his tragedy-laden history. The enormity of his series can be seen all throughout this rundown, with the edit making use of episodes of the show, quotes from novels, and comic panels alike. It's not all that surprising that something as influential as Doctor Who has so much material, but it helps a rocks-for-brains Yankee like myself wrap their head around how much there is to see with this series. Everything from the analysis that was covered in the sneak peek serves as a good basic introduction to the Doctor, with everything that follows delving deeper at a pace that both maximizes its time and remains easy to follow. It all flows together really nicely too. Going from the Doctor's love of adventure to the arsenal they use during those adventures, transitioning from that arsenal to the TARDIS they keep it all in, and branching off from the Doctor's many enemies to the Daleks and how Gallifrey met its supposed end all exemplify this. The way all these topics lend themselves to one another makes for a seamless viewing experience, so hats off to Liam and Ben for a rundown well written. This analysis also has a really funny cutaway gag. The ones that have Dummy in them tend to be ones I enjoy, and this is no exception. Dummy picking apart the timey-wimey bullshit that surrounds tools like the D-Mat feels very fitting for him, and Boomstick shooting him with it lines up with the Gurr clip from Invader Zim playing on the monitor, which is too perfect. Wiz and Boomstick promptly forgetting about Dummy also sets up what happens later during the animation, which is a nice touch. In general, the Doctor's rundown feels very tonally in sync with the source material it's analyzing, a strength it shares with Rick's analysis. It takes the Doctor and his exploits just seriously enough to work while still being cheesy and fun all throughout. There are a ton of references and iconic moments packed in here that will surely delight any Doctor Who fan, and even more impressively, it's still extremely enjoyable to someone totally new to the series. Overall, it's just fantastic. Returning to what I was alluding to before though, one big thing that brings Rick and the Doctor's analyses together is how they're structured very similarly. They open by talking about their companions, then getting into the basics of each of them before eventually delving into their tragic pasts and what makes them the spacefaring geniuses they are in their shows. It's a subtle choice in the script that highlights what makes Rick and the Doctor so similar, leading viewers who don't know much about either of them to realize, oh, yeah, these two make perfect sense for a death battle matchup. It's subtle, but the effect is definitely there, and I love getting to dissect writing tricks like this. And you know what else I love doing? Appreciating a job well done on death battle edits, and that's something I have no shortage of opportunities to do here. This was Max's first solo project as an editor for the show, and he did an incredible job. I don't know how he just waltzed into the opportunity to edit 2 of his most wanted episodes back to back, but I guess when you're as OP as him, you can make anything happen. Not only does he do a good job at matching the clips up to what's being discussed, but he also adds some really impressive motion graphics as well, including Rick on the stairs, the panels detailing Rick's universe-destroying tech, the TARDIS tanking Zeus's lightning, and the TARDIS reshaping its own interior dimension. It's extremely impressive for a one-man job, and it makes me confident we'll only see bigger and better things from Max as he gets further acclimated to his new position. So yeah, Rick vs. the Doctor's analyses are very good indeed. I'm not the right person to gush about how well they encapsulate and represent the series in question, but on an objective level, they're very well made. The Doctors in particular made me very interested in checking out their series. I mean, how couldn't I be when an almost 8-minute rundown only left me wanting to know even more about them? But we had to get to this episode's battle eventually, so how did that turn out? The short answer is also very good, but we're not here for short answers, are we? First of all, this is the Rooster Teeth team's outing for this season, and I'd say they did a damn good job. I think this matchup was a great fit for them, and they did an amazing job replicating Rick and Morty's art style for their appearances and making the 14th Doctor fit in with said art style. The 3D settings for blips and chits and the TARDIS interior all look excellent as well, so this battle is boasting some serious visual quality on all counts. As for the voice acting, it's generally pretty good. I've been going back and forth on how I feel about Brent Williams as Rick. In some takes, he sounds very convincing in the role, whereas in others, he just sounds like a guy trying to do the Rick voice. Liam's pretty consistent with his Morty at least, even if like most of his speaking roles, it doesn't have too much presence in the animation. But as for the 14th Doctor, he's voiced by Elliot Crossley, and I don't know if the role could have been cast better if Death Battle had tried. I mean, if Crossley's a good enough David Tennant sound-alike to voice the 10th Doctor in official Doctor Who material, he's definitely good enough to lend his voice to this. And he does a great job all throughout, capturing both the Doctor's love of adventure and his more serious side in equal measure. Cracking stuff all around. And finally, before we get into the fight, let's talk about the soundtrack that accompanies it. Wubba Lubba Allons-y might get a lot of shit for its title, but I don't think anyone can say it's anything less than an excellent song. It meshes the techno and orchestral sounds of Rick and Morty and Doctor Who's themes together to create a grand and energetic piece, perfectly suiting a high-tech battle through time and space. Listening to it on its own feels like an adventure in itself, with the techno refrain and orchestral segments inspiring images of other worlds and grand intergalactic voyages in my mind's eye. It's yet another banger from Aaron this season. You absolutely love to hear it. Now let's get to the fight itself, which starts with Rick and Morty having rear-ended the TARDIS in a classic case of space traffic accidents. Morty wants to exchange insurance information like the nerd he is, but the based Rick decides to shout at the other party instead, which is the objectively correct response. But the Doctor perfectly deflects by paying Rick no mind, instead heading on his way. This, of course, pisses Rick off more than any real argument ever could, and he grabs the controls of the space cruiser and gives chase. This is pretty much the ideal way to set this fight up, and since it's a death battle in space, Space Hawaii and the Randy Kool-Aid constellation are both in the background. I'm starting to think all the recent space death battles happened in the same solar system for some reason, and I don't think it's just for the fun references. I swear it's not a pointless tidbit, it's a giant conspiracy that the death battle team is conspiring to pull off. The only thing I haven't figured out yet is why. Anyway, Rick fires a bunch of lasers at the TARDIS as it flies away, and it attempts to jump through space to escape. But unfortunately for the Doctor, Rick doesn't play like that. So he shoots out a tether that latches onto the police box just in time, pulling the space cruiser into a time vortex. This is a good early indicator for how much ground this fight is going to cover, and as another bonus for the eagle-eyed viewer, the stickers on the space cruiser have been changed. One is Wiz's rock and roll symbol, one is a Bill Cipher nod, and the last one is a message I choose to interpret as being intended for people who comment on Versus-related videos just to post their matchups. You know who you are. Rick leaps out and flies up to catch the tether before it comes loose, but not before telling the space cruiser to keep Morty safe in his absence. This is a nice little moment for Rick, showing that he's still concerned with his grandson's safety even during a spite-fueled space chase. And even neater is the fact that the following laser blasts aren't the ship's self-defense measures, but they're instead the result of Morty accidentally pressing a button. You all know how I feel about small details in death battle fights by now, so you can probably guess that I like this a lot. Eventually, the space cruiser, Rick, and the TARDIS are all tossed out of the vortex at different points, and the Doctor lands with shock at the broken tether still lodged in his ship. But this is interrupted by the screaming sun rising over the horizon, a reference that comes a bit out of nowhere but is still pretty funny. I like that the Doctor is amused by it too. With how much they enjoy seeing the universe's endless wonders, I think they'd regard a lot of the wild stuff from Rick and Morty's adventures like this. Rick comes crashing in through a portal to interrupt this scene, and he and the Doctor go tumbling into the Blips and Chits arcade, leading to an absolute avalanche of death battle callbacks on the arcade machines. The idea of a fighting game with death battle combatants goes insanely hard, but I think my favorite ones are horse shadowing, calling back to how Rick Doctor was hinted at in Billcord, Columbo the Kira Files, which makes me even more confident that all the Columbo references are eventually going to result in Columbo vs. Light, and this one with Bill on the screen, whose title literally translates to, "It's Bill Cipher." The Bill references have only been getting cheekier ever since his episode happened, and I personally am all for it. The Doctor and Rick exchange some great banter here as the latter takes out a cool sword, and the Doctor hilariously unsheathes a spoon, obviously calling back to his battle with Robin Hood. The ensuing duel is both exciting and hilarious, with the high stakes at play as Rick chases down the Doctor with his blade being made light of as the Doctor fends off his foe with a basic dining utensil. It hits just the right tonal sweet spot for this matchup and makes for a solid bit of proper combat. Rick eventually pushes the Doctor up against a railing, letting us see over his shoulder to the lower floors of Blips and Chits. Amazingly, the callbacks to past death battles still haven't stopped, as we see plenty of past combatants hanging out together and playing games. Visuals like Vader sitting alone at his birthday party and Megatron holding the table in his lap are comedy gold, but my favorite has to be the Chosen Undead and the Dragonborn sitting with Dimitri and being like, "Dude, your friend is bleeding all over the floor. What the fuck is up with that?" This just puts a big dumb grin on my face, man. I love being a fan of this show. The Doctor gets a fun line here that I presume is a reference to his show, and he parries Rick's sword out of his hand, again making for a funny contrast between their weapons of choice. I do wish the disarming strike had a bit more impact here, but I suppose this milder level of strength does match what they view Rick and the Doctor as having. Maybe just make the sword fly away faster to have it feel a bit more energetic? It's not that big of a deal, it's just something I noticed. But in truth, Rick's far from disarmed here. In fact, his cybernetics reach out and snatch up the Doctor to show off just how armed he really is. Okay, I'm sorry for the lame joke, but it is genuinely impressive how Rick has 3 sets of arms. It must mean he has 6 times the grabbing power! Rick uses these extra arms to toss the Doctor around for a bit. This is admittedly the low point of the fight for me, as it's rather slow, lacks impact, and doesn't amount to much. The Doctor using the sonic screwdriver to break free is cool, but the scene that follows it looks a bit strange. Rick and the Doctor are launched away in relatively static poses before suddenly swimming through the air to grab the falling portal gun, with Rick in particular basically swooping from one side of the screen to the other. I think the storyboards communicate the frantic nature of the scene a bit better by having both of them already be scrambling for the gun when they emerge from the explosion. As is, it's a weird blip in the pacing of the choreography that raises an eyebrow for me. The fighters fall through the screaming sun world before another portal takes them to a room full of weeping angels, which makes for a super cool scene. We as viewers know exactly what the fuck is up the second we see the statues, and it leads to a delightful bit of sabotage as the Doctor leads Rick astray. His eyes are wide open and red from not blinking despite the dust kicked up by their fall, whereas Rick blinks rapidly at his foe's advice, clearly showing his status as a fake fan of Doctor Who. This lets the Doctor portal out and return to the TARDIS, only to discover that a horde of Rick's duplicates are turning the inside of his police box into an average Chuck E. Cheese brawl. The Doctor's reaction is one that I understand to be something of a catchphrase for this incarnation, and Crossley's delivery of it is very funny. The Doctor notices the real Rick hiding amidst the chaos, but the decoys accost him before he can do anything, forcing him to drop the portal gun and run into the recesses of the TARDIS. All the Ricks try to give chase, but their little rampage has invoked the wrath of the TARDIS itself, leading them to be trapped in its halls while the Doctor returns to its main control room unharmed. This is a great way to work the TARDIS being sentient into the fight, and the Doctor's celebration of this is really charming. It gives off the vibe that the Doctor and the TARDIS are old friends helping each other out. If there's more stuff like this in the show, that makes me want to actually check it out even more. Following all that, the Doctor activates part of the TARDIS and brings out the D-Mat. I love this quiet moment where the Doctor hesitates in front of it, clearly showing his reluctance to use it in service of ending a life, no matter the circumstance. It's such a small thing to add, but it does wonders to make a pacifistic character like the Doctor feel truer to their canon self within the confines of a death battle. But before he gets the chance to wield the D-Mat, the Doctor turns around to find a portal on his back, and Rick jumps out of it before landing 2 laser shots to the Doctor's hearts. This is a really cool surprise, and it sets up for something even cooler during the finishing blow. But before that, we get Rick telling the Doctor to hurry up with his regeneration so he can get back to Morty. I gotta be honest, I'm not a fan of this line. Part of it comes from the delivery, as Williams' Rick voice sounds less and less like Rick the longer it goes on, but I also don't much care for the line as it's written. The class clown joke is fine, but I just can't picture Rick saying the latter part of the line in this circumstance. Maybe I'm wrong, and seasoned Rick and Morty fans can correct me in the comments, but as is, this line is there just to be a really obvious death flag, and I don't care for it. But I am a fan of the Doctor's monologue, because it's genuinely a really badass response to what Rick says. Rick called him an idiot, sure, but the Doctor basically dresses Rick down as a person. He's a nihilistic know-it-all who thinks he's untouchable, even when he's standing squarely in the Doctor's trap. Rick thinks he has his foe dead to rights with a gun to his head as his regeneration grows near, but the success of this plan relies on the Doctor accepting defeat in a seemingly hopeless situation. And that prospect would never be in character for him, something he makes clear as he stands up in spite of his wounds and continues talking. Miscalculating his enemy's will to live will prove to be the biggest mistake Rick will ever make, because his enemy is the Doctor, and he doesn't want to go. I could tell this was a reference to something, so I went digging to find out what, and it's actually something the 10th Doctor says right before his regeneration kicks in. Only there he was saying it out of fear that he was going to disappear forever. He was afraid of the impending death of that version of himself. Meanwhile, in Death Battle, the 14th Doctor is saying it in defiance of death, showing that he will fight Rick until his very last moments. It's a masterful reworking of one of Doctor Who's most iconic scenes, and it sets the stage for one hell of a final act. Delaying his regeneration for just a bit longer, the Doctor takes out the sonic screwdriver and cranks it up, frying Rick's blaster and making the portal gun malfunction. And with that, his regeneration kicks in full force, knocking Rick back and wrecking the TARDIS. This is really fitting, because much like the 10th Doctor's regeneration, it's been held back for so long that it manifests with explosive force, putting Rick even further on the back foot. Rick tries to make for the portal made by his gun doing the Pibby glitch, only for part of the TARDIS to collapse in front of it, blocking his path. Stuck between a dock and a hard place, he draws out his own genetic material and shoots it into the Doctor, just before getting crushed beneath falling rubble. The syringe of genes hits the Doctor in the neck, and it doesn't take long for him to groan in pain as a fully grown Rick bursts out of his chest, shouting his signature catchphrase in the process. Not sure how this isn't lethal enough to cancel the Doctor's regeneration, but I'm just a mouth-breathing versus enjoyer, so what would I know? The new Rick clone uses his advantageous position to roll away and snatch the D-Mat off the floor, turning and shooting it at the Doctor. But the Doctor has one last trick up his sleeve, and by using Rick's earlier plan against him, he turns around and lets the D-Mat beam pass through the portal on his back. The beam emerges from the portal on the wall, and just like that, Rick is erased from time in an instant, shown by his imprisoned copies fading into non-existence. This kill might not be super crazy, but it's a great way for the Doctor to take Rick out while staying true to his pacifistic nature. I'd even argue it's an appropriate end for Rick, too. Just like Wiz and Boomstick say, he's relied too heavily on being the more clever fighter, and that's led to him being outsmarted one final time. It's a really good finisher for this matchup, and I quite like it. After the screen flashes white, we see that we're back at the fight's inciting incident, only this time Rick is absent as now he never existed to begin with. We get a nice exchange between the Doctor and Morty before the former signs off, waving at the camera while saying to not be a cynic. I like to think the Doctor is addressing the audience here, telling them to take the result of the battle with an open mind instead of thinking it could be somehow biased. I have no idea if that was the intent, but what's the point of art if you can't draw your own conclusions from it? It also makes sense for the Doctor to regenerate back into his current body, since the 14th Doctor is the only instance accepted as canon where the Doctor regenerated into a previous version of himself. And to cap off this animation, we get a funny little scene where a ghost Rick shows up and tells Morty he'll haunt his ass if he forgets him, only for Morty to immediately prove he already has. It's a bit of a shame we didn't get the Doctor taking Morty on as his new companion like everyone was predicting, but I could also imagine something like this being a plot point in Rick and Morty. It's good stuff. And that'll do it for Rick vs. the Doctor's animation. I'm not nearly as crazy about it as I have been for other fights this year, but this is a really nice watch that's full of great character moments and references that are sure to please fans of these two. I probably didn't get as much out of it as I could have if I was more familiar with their shows, but I'm happy to say I still enjoyed it a great deal. The verdict is surprisingly detailed, certainly more so than I expected it to be for this matchup at least. I'm not complaining though, I always like it when death battles cover all their bases in the aftermath of their animations. It's fairly standard outside of that, doing a solid job at detailing all the advantages the Doctor had over Rick. It's a solid conclusion to a solid episode. So that's Rick vs. the Doctor. It's not an episode I feel too strongly about, but it's still another really solid entry into Death Battle's 10th season. The fact that it introduces 2 new series to the show is a big positive in its corner, even if my lack of investment in those series means it won't hit the same highs for me as it does for others. 8 out of 10 from me. It's a very fun episode that I'll definitely enjoy coming back to in the future. Wait, no, that's a different time travel series. Coming back to this episode will be an excellent adventure. No, goddamn it! And looking ahead to the next time... Okay, look, I know everyone's gonna have their say on Goku vs. Superman 3 happening in the first place. I'm not here to beat a dead horse. But I will say, even though I totally get why the team wanted to do this, that doesn't mean I have to like that they're doing it. To me, Goku vs. Superman is a debate that represents the older era of not just Death Battle, but versus debating as a hobby. I would have preferred it stayed there, with its tumultuous reputation as the episode people cite when they talk about hating Death Battle relegated to background noise now that the show is truly in its prime. But I suppose that doesn't matter much now, does it? Clearly the team had ideas for a revisit they wanted to put into practice, otherwise this wouldn't be happening. Yes, I said revisit. This isn't Goku vs. Superman 3 in the sense that it's another follow-up to the self-described original classic and irrelevant sequel. This is more like Mario vs. Sonic 2018 or Link vs. Cloud 2021 in the sense that it's a wholly new approach to the matchup, so I can only hope it's able to stand on its own 2 feet and deliver something worthwhile. This is one of those episodes where I'm expecting to get very little out of it, meaning it has all the room in the world to impress me. And from what we've seen of it so far, I'm hopeful it will do just that. But in the meantime, thanks for sticking around and watching this review. Go watch Biff's video on the episode to see my reaction to it along with our usual group, and don't forget to subscribe while also checking out the other creators listed in the description. I'll see you again soon in the next video.